Hey, this is The Hard Truth with Tony Shaffer, brought to you by 6 Hour Never Settle. When I was in combat, I had a choice of what I carried. I always carried the best. I always carried a 6 Hour, so I highly recommend 6 Hour is your choice for personal protection. The America Out Loud Talk Radio Network is our network, also available on the America Out Loud Podcast Network. Check us out at projectsentinel.net and thelondoncenter.org. More about our organizations and what we do. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Rumble. And of course, here on our network, we're going to go through a number of things with a good friend of mine. I love Doug. He's an amazing colonel, Colonel Doug MacGregor, the hero of the Battle of 73 Easting. He's written several books, Breaking the Phalanx, which actually changed doctrine in DOD. I don't know how you feel about it, Doug, but they credit you for helping shape the Iraq invasion by your thinking in that book and the idea of modularization of the military, which I thought was a great idea. And obviously, you have a new book out, Margin of Victory, 5 Battles That Changed the Face of Modern War. We'll talk a little bit about that. Well, anyway, thank you for being here, Doug.
Sure. If I may, I would revise the introduction in one way.
Sure.
So I'm the hero of the 73 Easting. There were 1,100 of us in the 2nd Squadron on the battlefield that day, and I would say there were certainly 1,100 heroes.
Yes, sir.
No mean the only one or alone. It's important to keep that in mind.
Yes, sir. Oh, no, I agree, and I would encourage people to go out and check. I think the History Channel is a great, very accurate rendition of what happened. And
well, I also wrote a book about it. It's called Warrior's Rage.
Warrior's Rage.
And that was published, I think 2009 or 2010, somewhere there. And, people might find it of interest. And a number of movie producers have expressed an interest in it. But I think it's a tough nut to crack right now. But I think at some point it will be very interesting to people because it's a positive story about the U.S. military. And I think we could use those.
Right. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you know, Doug, I produced something called Chain of Command, which was done by Nat Geo, that basically my old friend Joe Dunford, General Joe Dunford, wanted us to actually show what the Pentagon was doing well during his time as chairman, which is out. And now we've been told we can maybe do a season 2 of that, which we're working on right now. So I'll keep you informed on that. So let me start our interview with a quote. Jonathan Parshall said in his keynote speech titled 1942, The Crux of War. This is what he said. Far fewer wars than one might think have outcomes that are actually preordained. Wars are conditional. Their outcome depends on a chain of events, each affected by ones coming before it and likewise those coming after it. So, Doug, is the outcome of the Ukraine conflict preordained?
Well, gosh, I think that historian's quote probably fits most descriptions of dating. I'm not sure it's very illuminating from a military history standpoint. When I wrote Margin of Victory and I picked 5 battles, I did it with something else in mind.
Yeah.
I was trying to demonstrate a couple of very important things that Americans absolutely do not understand. In fact, they're not alone, but I think it's a huge problem in the United States. One was most battles, and for that matter, wars, are won certainly at least 10 to 20 years before they occur.
Right.
And that's a function of decisions that are made on organization, leadership, training, education, as well as technology, and how well you organize to exploit technology, which is something the U.S. Army does very poorly. The naval and air forces understand that everything for success in their worlds depends upon organizing to exploit technology.
Right.
We have lots of stupid people who say, well, we equip men. We don't turn it around and say we're manning the equipment. Well, they're wrong. The truth is, if you're successful, it's because you've manned it effectively. Right. You've altered your organization for combat in order to exploit technology that's new and different from what you had before.
Right.
The second part of this was what has profoundly changed. And the revolution that I was trying to get people to understand is really this revolution of indirect fire, or what you would call standoff attack. long range strike. There are all sorts of names you can use for it. And how the emergence of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, literally from seabed to space, linked to a whole range of long range strike systems. And long range, frankly, to me, as a soldier, means almost anything beyond my line of sight.
Mhm.
All of that results in a profound way that changes the way you fight and organize to fight. And we really haven't come to terms with that. We still think in terms of long range strike that comes from the Air Force or the Navy as augmenting our artillery. We don't
Right.
see ourselves as part of this new paradigm. And that's playing out right now in Ukraine. One of the things that the Russians have done very effectively, and it's not surprising since they were the first after World War II to really see this, is that they have organized their ISR and tightly linked it to a whole range of strike systems from automatic mortars all the way up to tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and so forth, to the
Right.
point where early in the campaign, there was a fight in and around Kharkov, and an apartment block was abandoned, and the Ukrainians went across the street into a mall and set up essentially artillery and fighting positions. When the word reached the Russians within 7 minutes launched a cruise missile from the Black Sea that targeted and destroyed that mall area with all of the Ukrainians in it. That all took 7 minutes. That's impossible in the U.S. military. And that leads you to a whole other discussion about unity of command.
Right.
Someone at every level, one person, one man is in command. We don't do that. We have multiple single service headquarters augmented to quote unquote cooperate and be joint. And they all fight over turf, access, their role, leadership, and so forth. The
So
Russians
yeah,
how to do that infinitely better than we did.
so that's the thing. Look, I've come through the system. I enlisted in '81, was commissioned in '83. I can honestly say that other than going to spy school, going down to Camp Perry to become a spy, none of the education, professional education, ever related directly to what I had to do to be effective in combat. From going through officer basic. No, Doug. I'm completely serious. I mean,
look, I am not surprised. I agree with you. And one of the things that did not endear me to my superiors was that both during Desert Storm and afterwards, when I commanded at Fort Riley, the paradigm I adopted was tactical paradigm, battle drills, formations, and so forth, and integration with air power was really very German.
Mhm.
And to a lesser extent, somewhat influenced at the time by Soviet practices. But I effectively abandoned whatever the U.S. Army was preaching, which was never quite clear to me. And as a result, we were successful in the desert in '91. And then the squadron I commanded set a record at the National Training Center,
right.
which once again did not endear me to anybody. We were the high performance unit in history. But it was because I simply did not do what the U.S. Army suggested because I never saw that it made any sense. So
Right.
I agree with you completely.
Yeah, no, and you're credited widely for all of the doctrine and tactics you were able to come up with. But I had the same thing because when I went through officer basic as a second lieutenant, they made us jack of all trades, second lieutenants. We're supposed to know everything in MI. It's like that's stupid. And next thing I know, I'm doing chasing terrorists in Europe, doing things I was never trained to do. It's like you just got to go do it. You got to figure it out. And then same thing in Afghanistan. My book Operation Dark Heart, which I've talked to you about a little bit before. Doug, I was literally going to Command and General Staff College, literally the month before I deployed, learning air-land battle, knowing full well I wasn't going to do a thing regarding the FLOT or FIBA in Afghanistan. Yet I was required to know that to a great level of certainty because reasons, I guess. But it added absolutely nothing to my capacity to be effective in combat in that current war. And that's what it's like. Now we would probably be well served to go look at the FLOT and FIBA issues if we're actually going to be facing a near-peer adversary, which now we're not. So it's just amazing.
The problem is, of course, that air-land battle was really obsolete when it was adopted.
Right.
It was essentially an attempt to replicate what the Germans did in the 1940s. There was some language from Soviet doctrine incorporated into the thing, deep battle, this sort of business. But it really wasn't what we needed at the time, but it was such a breath of fresh air compared with the nonsense that already existed that everybody celebrated it.
Right.
We need a fundamental reexamination of everything, not just in light of what we've seen happen in Ukraine, but you can speak also to this very well. You had access to overhead surveillance and a lot of information that frankly should be available today in most tactical formations.
Right.
There's a way to do that, but we haven't really done it.
Right.
And and one of the things that, well, you're saying that we should be like special operations. Well, in some ways, yes. And that was the point I made in Breaking the Phalanx,
Right.
because I thought they were headed down the right road. But, the sad part is nothing is going to change in the near term, but perhaps this experience in Ukraine will help us a little bit, because clearly things there are very different. You have a battlefield right now where the Russians sitting in southern Ukraine, and keep in mind, they are inching incrementally forward every day. So if you look at the line of contact, 160 miles long, it continues to move north and west, albeit slowly, because they're operating in this tremendous sea of mud, which limits your mobility. But you have a situation right now, and I watched this the other day on a video. It was sent to me from Ukraine, and it showed a Ukrainian brigade dismounting to walk across the field, because if you stay on the roads, obviously they're identified. If you're on the road, you're going to be destroyed instantly. But the Russians, of course, found them. This is roughly about 6 to 10 miles in front of their defensive positions, or at least their perimeter. They identified where they were, and within 2 minutes, they were under effective strike from a variety of systems.
Right.
Again, rocket artillery, tube artillery, and so forth. The entire brigade was annihilated in the space of about 60 seconds. This is a different world from the one you and I entered in the Army.
Oh, I get it. No, Doug, I understand.
No, but I'm saying, when you entered the Army and the things that you were taught and the experience that you had, what I had in 91, I mean, I drove through artillery and had artillery shot at me, but what we're talking about is beyond that, in a magnitude that most Americans cannot conceive of, so that you can completely obliterate something, and you can do it because you are protected by layered air defenses. And that's what we don't have. We have no means of protecting ourselves from air and missile attack on the scale of the Russians.
Right. And I want to go through and kind of get to that and the nuclear issue as well. So to that point, and to your point, every major success we've had in combat came from a great deal of preparation, which I would argue with you, we're not there right now. Plan Orange. Back years ago, Tony Kukolo, Commandant of the War College, Tony and I sat down and how do we do what you're talking about? How do we try to figure things out ahead of time? And he wanted us to work on a Plan Orange of the 21st century. Doug, I went to Dunford, to Joe Dunford with this. Joe may not be happy with me talking about this, but me and my merry little team of rebels, to include Jim Woolsey and Bud McFarland and Dick Newton, Ambassador Hank Cooper, we all sat down and said, we need a grand strategy. And you know who vetoed that, Doug? You want to guess who vetoed the grand strategy?
No, I can think
of a guy named Mattis, James Mattis, said it was too hard to do. I'm not joking. It was too hard to do. It's like, what? We have this huge, most expensive military ever on the face of the earth, just kind of meandering around looking for things to do without a strategy. And so to me, am I missing? I mean, I know I'm only Lieutenant Colonel here, Doug, but am I missing something? To me, the strategy should be there. That's what we build from to build success. So, I mean,
well, truthfully, I would argue we've never done it. And if you go back to the Second World War, our performance in that war was not some brilliant achievement.
No, I agree.
And I don't blame people like Marshall for that, because he inherited something. He did the best he could. If you go all the way back to MacArthur as Chief of Staff of the Army, he tried to establish a system where he could identify talented officers. He created examinations, study programs. He wanted to turn the Staff College into something akin to the German War College. And he was obstructed throughout the entire time as Chief of Staff. And he was ultimately told, in an army of 250,000 or 70,000, we're lucky to find 20 or 30 officers who are ever going to meet the requirements that you've stipulated, General. And so, he left there. He had trouble just purchasing a couple of tanks for exploratory tactical exercises. So he had a lot of problems, but the situation didn't improve a lot. And by the time Marshall got there, he had to make virtue of necessity and do a lot of things quickly. And we lost a lot of people as a result of not being adequately trained and prepared. And, if you read it, there's a great book called Advance and Destroy, Patton and the Bulge, by a man named Ricards. And if your readers read that, they'll discover that Patton is always throwing up his hands because he says, I can't just run around and relieve people. There just aren't that many people who know what they're doing. It's
Right.
not their fault. We have not trained them. They're not educated.
Right.
And I think we have this sort of same complacency affects us now. And people tell me in the Navy it's just as bad. It may be. I don't know. I always thought the Navy had an advantage because you still had to take the ship to sea, keep the water out and the people in. That required some degree of technical competence and brains. If you were in an aircraft, you still had to take off and land without killing yourself. So again, that was another IQ test. But we have nothing on the ground, nothing. And I think the generals like it that way. I really do, because that allows them to essentially pick and choose whomever they want and make them fellow members of the GO club. Remember, how many times have you heard, well, he's a real war fighter. That guy, we need him. And I would say, who the hell is this? What has he done? Well, he's probably married to someone's daughter who's a 4-star. It's absurd.
No, I've seen the way that general officers are picked, and the few I've worked with and I've respected, Tony Cuccolo, to mention one. Tony and I were in combat together. He seemed to not want to go along with a lot of the nonsense and was trying to break out of the kind of mundane, let's just kind of go along, get along. But that brings me to the next point, Doug, is this arrogance of culture. You just mentioned one form of arrogance. You have these general officers who presume to know, hey, this guy's better than another because, reasons. And we have this now infestation within our thinking at the strategic level, at the Pentagon, not only Army, but the entire Joint Staff. And they're constantly projecting our values onto other cultures, especially regarding Russians. This constant messaging about, Tony Blinken and all these guys, well, they must be reacting this way. No, they're not going to react this way. And the dismissal of Putin's grievances constantly, like, we're just don't worry about that. Yeah, he's been saying the same thing for almost 20 years, but he doesn't really mean it. Of course he means it. And the level of complete detachment from reality is mind-boggling. I mean, I'm an intelligence officer. My job is to assess and make recommendations to how an adversary is going to do something or not do something so that we can then be there ahead of them. I don't know how many times, Doug, I've made cogent recommendations based on what the outcome is likely to be and ignored because, it doesn't meet our political framework. And that's my question to you. We seem to have not only this dismissal of reality for what it is because it doesn't match the narrative of the political class. I would argue people like Mark Milley, have become politicians in uniform. They're more concerned about their next job, their corporate position than they are actually doing their job. And in the case of Milley, I think he's almost become a Trotskyite. And my question to you is when he talks about white rage, is that because he's got hemorrhoids or does he actually have a legitimate claim to being a Marxist?
Well, I wouldn't want to guess and confirm the first option. But I suspect that he's just someone who's doing what he's done throughout his career. My experience on active duty taught me that the vast majority of people that are advanced to the rank of general officer are people that are go along, get along people that question nothing, that simply repeat whatever the boss says, and have this positive attitude that everything can be done, and let's just work ourselves to death some more, and the general will be a success. If he's a success, we're a success.
Yeah.
I don't know what you do about it unless you have a fundamental overhaul and change the people. Marshall said, I did not change the culture of the United States Army. I changed the people, and the people changed the culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we have to understand. And, I hate to say it, but I don't see much hope for most of the people at the top these days. And look, people respond to the incentive structure. They ask themselves, well, who's the success story? And if you're a young major who's ambitious, you look up and say, well, who made it to 4 stars? Well, you and I could sit here and say, oh my God, those are some of the worst people I can imagine.
Right.
That's true. But from the standpoint of the major, he says, well, look at you. How far did you get? Why should we listen to you? I mean, listen, this is the sort of thing that goes on. It's the only time you get change is, when you have a real emergency, and that's what Marshall confronted. And he wasn't always right in the people that he picked. He couldn't waste a lot of time dwelling on who is perfectly qualified or not. But I'd say about 60 to 70% of the time he was right.
Right.
We came in late. We didn't have to fight for very long. We never faced the Imperial Japanese armies that were on the continent, which were on the whole much better than the troops we faced in the Pacific.
Right.
The Navy fell apart because we sank most of it in an attrition war that we fought. And so we got away with it in the Pacific. In Europe, it was a long, slow slog online, and we took a lot of casualties, and we covered it up. One of the things that you find out about the bulge, we said, oh, the Germans had 200,000 casualties, and we had 70,000. When you look at the actual figures, just in the bulge, the Germans had 11,000 men killed. 11,000 with some number of about 18,000 casualties total. And we, on the other hand, were at 78,000.
Wow.
With far more killed than the Germans. So, when in doubt, lie.
Yeah.
And we did. We lied a lot during the Second War. And Stimson, when the war was over, he wanted to conduct investigations against Eisenhower, against Bradley, a number of people. It was all dropped. And, I think it was Churchill that said about Montgomery, when you're winning, it can be said that anything you did was right.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's what we've had a problem with. Now, in Korea, Vietnam, things were different. And we didn't win.
Yeah.
And we didn't win, arguably, in Iraq, although I keep pointing out that people don't understand the futility and stupidity of occupation and trying to export democracy at gunpoint.
I'm with you on that.
And if you had gone in with a very narrow purpose and executed that and gotten out, nobody would give a damn what happened in Afghanistan or Iraq. But we didn't.
Right. No, I've said that about Afghanistan over and over. It's like we long overstayed our ability to actually influence things on the ground in a positive way. So next, Doug, to go into this real quick, it's back to Ukraine, because so much of what you said applies directly to what we're doing now in Ukraine. And I think there's a complete dismissal of the facts. Right now, we have spent, according to this little cheat sheet I've got, the table of U.S. aid to Ukraine, supplemental appropriations, $113.4 billion. It's a lot of money. And I would argue that's the strategy. Just throw money at it. And then as we go through this and we see these things being used, I've said before, Sun Tzu once said, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And I tend to believe that's what's going on here, because again, the numbers I'm looking at here, one of the outlets I listened to regarding Ukraine said the Russians over the next year are going to produce 1,500 tanks, new, not even going into the reserves there. And so that's like 3 tank armies of worth of stuff. And then Ukraine has no hope of matching that. So Doug, how is it and then as we're speaking today, Bakhmut is finally fallen, I think, pretty much. And yet somehow people interpret that as, oh no, the Ukrainians are wearing down the Russians. Like, okay, how is it we're so far apart on what's going on versus what the media is saying about this?
Well, it goes back to your original comment. You talked about emotion.
Yeah.
And people in Washington don't think, they emote.
Yeah.
And as soon as this began, there were all sorts of utterly false, misleading assumptions made. But the most important thing is everybody emoted and said, oh, this is a wonderful opportunity to wear down and harm and punish Russia. And ultimately, we can force a regime change. We can destroy their economy. So we'll sweep Russia away, the last obstacle to denationalizing Europe, opening borders, importing migrants from Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. We can totally destroy Russia, as we have had so much success destroying much of Europe and, oh, by the way, our own country.
Yeah.
Well, there were problems with those assumptions and goals, but people emoted. And now you're asking them to step forward and say, gosh, we were wrong. our assumptions were flawed. No one in Washington ever admits that they're wrong. And they hope that ultimately, when this fails, and it will, and it falls apart, that, we'll walk away and they can turn to the media that is obedient to their orders and say, change the subject.
Right.
Let's talk about something else, and hope that the American electorate forgets, because Americans are very good at forgetting what they don't care to remember.
Right.
So, it really is emotion in the worst possible way.
Well, to that point, Doug, I mean, we've only got about a minute left if I have to go to stop our first half here, is the fact that so much of what you just laid out is essentially a policy that will result in catastrophic failure, not only of our military strategy, but of our economy, because so much of what's going on right now is damaging. I mean, the more you have to pay to a third country, you fund all this, you're taking loans out, you're devaluing the dollar, you're actually, all this quantitative easing. Doug, I don't think people fully understand how much all this printing of money is damaging their own wealth. And
well, you realize, Tony, that effectively happened after the Vietnam War, that LBJ managed to do the same kind of damage. And the damage was so severe that Nixon took us off the gold standard.
Right. I remember that.
If we had remained on the gold standard, we would have eventually had to default. So he took us off, which allowed us to, quote unquote, print money. But we were also a different nation. We had a large manufacturing base that we had not yet exported overseas. We had a large population of skilled labor, and they had people that wanted to work. And we were very homogenous, and we were still very nationalistic.
Right.
You put all those things together. Now let's look at the United States today. That country is gone. We live in a very different country. So the problem is that, yes, we are going to confront financial collapse. It's coming. It's nearer than most Americans realize. And when it strikes, suddenly everything that's happening beyond the borders of the United States will become meaningless.
So
and we will focus here at home.
Yeah.
God help Washington when that starts.
So, Doug, we're going to have to cut it off on that high note for the first half of our show. But look, Doug, I appreciate your being here. This has been a great overview of the scope of military and strategic issues that we're facing, or not facing, I should say. And so we're going to take a break right now. This is The Hard Truth with Tony Shaffer, and we'll be right back. Hey, this is The Hard Truth with Tony Shaffer, powered by Sig Sauer, Never Settle. I had a choice of what I carried in combat. I always carried the best. And today, I'm actually highlighting my put together M11A1, which is a version of what I carried in combat. I now own. Sig Sauer does amazing work with weapons, and if you want a weapon that's going to always be there and be reliable, never settle for anything other than Sig Sauer. And we are on the America Out Loud Talk Radio Network, also available on the America Out Loud Podcast Network. And check us out. Check our group out at projectsentinel.net and londoncenter.org. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Rumble. And of course, here we are again for part 2 of the show. I'm joined now by the effervescent Chris Cordani, the vivacious Elizabeth Brechtenkamp, and the ever tan and happy Tanya Miller from Hawaii. So here we go. That was an interview we had with Doug MacGregor. We were talking about his newest book, Margin of Victory, the 5 battles that changed the face of modern war. And we talked about the context of our own strategy within the United States, what has worked and has not worked regarding the last few wars, and putting it in context of Ukraine and what we're doing in Ukraine. I did mention to Doug, and I think it's something worth noting, we have spent at this point $113 billion on Ukraine. Ukraine, notably, is not a member of NATO. There's been no specific strategic interests expressed or noted that I'm aware of relating to why we're spending the money and what we're trying to achieve, other than annoying the Russians and trying to, in some instances, according to Joe Biden, engage in removing Putin from power, which, again, I'm not sure what the value is of that.
Can I put that in context, Tony? I want to put that in context.
Ultimately, it's all emotional. So go ahead, give the context, Chris.
Well, I want to give you a context of the $113 billion, Tony. This is $13 billion more than what Dr. Evil intended to hold the entire world ransom for. We just flipped away in taxpayers' money to Ukraine.
That's right.
I'm not joking. I am joking. I'm not joking.
Yeah. Well, and no cat to go along with it either. So
right. Right.
So well, that's the thing. So why is it? Let's go around the room. Why is it that we have so many politicians completely devoted to Ukraine and funding their effort without regard to the reality we're facing regarding the fact Russians probably going to win? So anybody want to throw in on that?
I can get my only guess is I don't have an educated as the military expertise and experience as some of you do, but it just seems to me that that's propaganda. And it's nobody's going to go out alone. So whatever the narrative that's being shaped, there's always going to be certain politicians and certain people that are going to follow what they're led to. And so I just think that not everyone is strong enough to stand up and ask these questions and bring up these points on long-term strategy. What do we gain from this? What is this going to entail? But that's my first get-go is like, they're just not that strong. Not all of them are that strong enough or willing to be that strong of a character to go up against what they can tell is the propaganda. I mean, the media is leading us into what's going to happen. It's pretty clear. It's always set ahead of time in advance. So it just seems that's what it reads to me. I don't know.
So, I always revert back to classic children's stories that were really not meant just for children. I always go back to The Emperor's New Clothes. Do you remember that? Does anybody remember that?
I heard that during Greg Queen's Story Hour.
It's a great, thanks. That's nice. But anyway, so it's a great metaphor. The whole point is that the king, I think a lot of what they're doing in Washington, all the people are just throwing money in it. Like you said, it's emotional and people don't want to stand up and rock the boat. So in The Emperor's New Clothes, the emperor says, he's so self-centered. He's so arrogant. He says, I want something beautiful. So these guys come in and they trick him. They deceive him and they say, only people with really fine taste, people, upper crust will be able to see your clothes. They're invisible. They create nothing. But they say, oh, these clothes are so beautiful. They're so exquisite. Only really fine people can see this. The dude is walking down the street naked, but nobody.
This is a story about Joe Biden.
Nobody has the nerve to say, oh, he's naked, because they're afraid that they'll be seen as a fool. I'm not going to point out the obvious, but this little boy in the back comes up and says, he ain't wearing no clothes. He basically, slightly different version, but it's a great metaphor showing how all these people just fall in line and the obvious is right there, but it takes a little boy. And so my kind of analogy is Trump was the little boy who stepped in. He's from the outside. He doesn't fit in with these people. And he's like, he ain't wearing no clothes. You guys need to set this straight. And so, I think it's that they're so afraid to rock the boat. And that's one of the main reasons why they really hate Trump so much. So, not all of them, but a lot of them. It's like, no, he wants to rock the boat. Even the Republicans, I can't say it's just the Democrats, but the guys who've been there forever, they don't want to lose their pensions. They don't want to, anybody kick them out of their seats. They love the power and they don't want to rock the boat. It's crazy. I also like what he said about we need to reassess everything we're doing. And so I was thinking, well, how would you, Tony, since you're a lieutenant colonel, how would you reassess what we're doing in Ukraine?
Well, like I said, I mean, look, first off, accept the reality.
A whole reexamination.
Well, no, that's what the first thing you do is accept the reality for what it is, not what you want it to be. And I think that's one of the things that's painfully clear. And Doug and I went through several examples where, and you guys know certain things I've said in the public and been a whistleblower on. It's like, we were saying these things were coming, and yet everybody ignored us. And yet we're the ones to blame. It was an intelligence failure. It wasn't an intelligence failure. It was a policy failure based on a presumption of an interpretation of the world that did not exist. Or even worse in some cases where you had elements of the government wanting to perhaps open door for certain things to happen, to fund certain things, to allow things to happen, because, gee, why would we worry about actually defending the American people? We have to have something to do. We have to have something with this, for this big military industrial complex to do, to be funded.
Right.
And I think that's one of the issues. Chris, you're going to jump in on this?
No,
next?
That's beneath the surface, and people
Right.
don't care what's beneath the surface. We also know that NATO loves the idea of maybe locking Russia out of the Atlantic, and of course access to the Arctic Ocean, as NATO is looking to bring in Finland as well.
Right.
Along with Ukraine. That's a deeper issue. But what people see is what the media tells them they see. And I'm going to say it again, like I said 1 week before. What all they seem to care about is what a rather unwise woman said. A bigger country attacked a smaller country, and a bigger country shouldn't attack a smaller country, because a smaller country shouldn't be attacked by a bigger country. And it's not nice for a bigger country to attack a smaller country. It's easy to show Vladimir Putin as the villain, because, well, basically, he's already written a manifesto against NATO in the first place. They want him to be a villain. So the easiest way to do it, watch what he did and make him look like a big bad bully.
But you're supposed to say that in a very condescending voice, like you're talking to children. Yeah. Anyway, that's all the difference.
No, I think Jean-Luc Picard, Karine Abdul-Jabbar, whatever her name is all over the map constantly on this stuff. But that is my next point, is that there's this arrogance, to your point, Elizabeth. They project this. We say it must be so. Therefore, if we say it has to be true, no matter what you think. And so it's this projection of their values, these aren't our values. I mean, I can comfortably say all of us here on our show are of a different mind than the administration. And the way that they go about it, though, is that when they say something, they will dismiss Putin. As I mentioned in the interview with Doug, Putin's been saying the same thing since the early 2000s, like, hey, NATO don't expand, don't come east. Don't presume upon us that you can just do whatever you want in areas that we used to hold, because we, the Russians, have concerns, a paranoia, if you will. It goes back to Catherine the Great. It is what it is. And the more they ignore what the Russians believe to be valid concerns, the more we prompt their reaction. And in some ways, you can almost postulate that because we have been so arrogant and ignoring what they're saying, we help contribute to the current war. And I know that people always say, well, if you say that, you're pro-Russian. I'm not pro-Russian. I spent most of my professional career fighting the Russians in the Cold War. So I don't want to hear this, you're pro-Russian, because I'm not.
And that's the propaganda.
That's the propaganda?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You're right.
Yeah.
You mentioned the military industrial complex. Sorry to interrupt, Tony.
Yeah, no, you're right.
But that's where the bravery, it's not just bravery. It's what are they giving up? Like Elizabeth brought up, it's like, what are they giving up? There's the money in the military industrial complex. It's the narrative. And so it's not just the bravery. It's also the character. But if because of the emotion, it's like they're riding that wave. They're just built up that narrative. They ride the wave. And then it's not, who's going to be brave enough to be the one that's going to shout out the obvious, right? Like your story.
Yeah.
And
like the little
who's going to be brave enough? Yeah. And then they can count on that once, if the truth were to come out, because back in the day, you used to be afraid. It was like you wanted to be on the right side of history, and you wanted in journalism, and you wanted to be able to do that. Well, nowadays, it's like they're going to be saved. They're going to be rescued. They're just going to follow the next thing because they easily forget. Like Colonel MacGregor brought up, they easily forget. And so we just follow the next, whatever the next lead and distraction story is. So, they kind of count on that a little bit.
Well, go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
the other thing is what's not obvious, because it's easy to talk about what's obvious out there. We can point out the obvious. What's not obvious, and what could get people emotionally riled up are a few things that the mainstream media and the administration is trying to hide. And yes, when asked about this, they blow it off. You saw, I've seen Kirby and Karine Jean-Pierre blow these things off. But the idea is we're in the middle of a pension and retirement crisis. Right. While taxpayer money from America and Americans who are, many of them are part of this or going to be suffering from this crisis, are paying pensions for people in Ukraine. This is something we just cannot do. And now, and of course, Zelensky has repeatedly said he wants young Americans to come and fight for Ukraine and put their lives on the line.
How is this getting sold to the American people? How is this even possible?
Well, that's the thing.
Crazy.
Well, that's why we're here. We're supposed to be educated.
Yeah.
And Tanya, that point, that's why we're. So let me walk through those 2 points real quick and let you guys comment on it. First off, on the issue, Tanya, you just brought up regarding our young men. Look, there's nothing in the world at this point that would require any young U.S. citizen to go fight anywhere. There's just nothing there at this point. Everything we're talking about can and should be dealt with either diplomatically or economically. There's no reason. Let me be very clear. As someone who's been in combat, there's no reason at this point for us to be in combat anywhere. It's just not. There's nothing there right now. There's nothing to be gained by using military force as a lead policy going and trying to solve issues we the United States have to deal with. That's the bottom line. And that's just, it is what it is. Secondly, so much of what's going on, though, Tanya, goes back to the fact that as we print money to meet these obligations, this 113, do you think that we taxpayers paid for that? Well, we did part of it, but most of that 113 billion came out of money the Federal Reserve printed. They just printed out of thin air. And that's where right now we have a government who spends almost a double of what it takes in regarding revenue. And Tanya, every time they do that, the very revenue they generate is devalued because the value of the dollar goes down, and the value of what you, Elizabeth, Chris, and I do, the value of our work goes down because they pay us in dollars. Those dollars are not worth as much. This is a cycle that's been set up, to Doug's point, going back to Nixon, that this has been horrible. And so, you could go out and buy a Big Mac for 74 cents in 74. What's it cost now? Almost $4? Think about that. And that's what's happened.
But yeah. Everything's more expensive. Baby formula is hard to get. Everything. I read somewhere.
But the point is, this has been done systemically.
Yes, it has been. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Look, it's kind of like the whole, once again, the metaphor of putting a frog in a pot of boiling water. He's going to jump out. But if he's sitting in a pot of nice, cool water and it gradually over a long period of time gets warmer and warmer, he doesn't recognize it. And exactly. And so many people in America, Tanya was saying, they don't dig deeper. They don't dig deeper to see what's really going on. Say that they're oblivious, I'm just going to go to my job and do my thing and vote for the wrong person. And they don't realize that it's happening systematically, especially when they realize they can get into the education. That's why they push so hard to get all this woke crap in elementary schools. First they had in high schools, then they get elementary schools. Now they're in pre-K because they know what they're doing. Yeah.
It's just
exactly.
Well, we know what we're doing right now. We're doing Tony's Take.
We're trying to educate people.
It is that time.
It is time for Tony's Take. That's brought to you by Sig Sauer.
All righty.
And I never settle. That's why I never settle for. You don't settle. Sig Sauer doesn't settle, and I don't settle for poor questions. But I do have to bring this up, and I know people will say maybe it's too early. The fact is, the shooting in Nashville was interesting for a lot of reasons, and not the least of which were the anti-gun people, the gun control people, grabbing onto this, and the administration blaming the evil, mean Republicans and those people who want to own a rifle and go hunting. The thing where I might be exaggerating that point. However, I want your take on this.
Sure.
There were a few points to this. Obviously, the shooter is an alphabet person. Okay, that's the best way to put it. She's a trans. She has serious mental issues, and probably stemming from a lot from.
And she was on the spectrum. She was on the autistic spectrum too. Yeah.
Exactly. So, the problems I saw were the alphabet. The alphabet advocacy groups were worried about their image.
Right.
And you had the administration jumping on this for gun control. Does anybody care what really happened to the kids, the teacher, the staff there, and of course about people with these serious mental illnesses walking around free and without help?
So, by the way, if anybody's interested, my pronouns are Apocalypse Now. Just if anybody's curious. And to that point, anybody who comes in with pronouns has a take on the world which is not productive to being part of positive society. And I think that's where this all goes back to, Chris. The person, the woman, the girl, I don't know what you want to call her, that she was deeply flawed because she had mental health issues. And she was actually in therapy. They were talking today in the news at the time of our taping that she had purchased legally 7 weapons, despite the fact she was under psychiatric care. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means it wasn't the guns. That means the fact is that she had issues with her perception of reality. We've been talking about perceptions of reality all day today. And this one at the micro level was one which became too much of a burden for her. Her last comments to one of her friends, apparently on Instagram, was, I can't deal with life. I want to end it. Well, that's pretty much what she did. And the fact is that the issue here is mental health, not guns. And the fact that you have the progressive left turning people into victims. So in this case, they've actually been putting forth, Chris, the idea that violence is an acceptable tool to mental instability. It's like, oh yeah, it's not her fault. She was pushed, and you Christians are all bad, so you deserved it. That's what they've been saying.
That's what I've been hearing. And you watch some of these comments that are on that are all over social media. They're saying that
the political left,
the political
left has accepted violence as an acceptable form of political speech.
Right. And this not long after the alphabet community pushed forth a trans day of vengeance to be set for April 1st.
April 1st. That's a good day. Yeah.
It's often said by the left that people on the right use words to insinuate violence. The fact is, what's been going on is they've been doing the same thing. I mean, especially since 2000. We already heard the likes, longer than that, but we've already heard the likes of, what was that? Aunt Esther from Sanford and Son, the congresswoman out of Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, who said that, who told people to burn cities down, burn things down, and make make a big ruckus, that sort of thing.
Maxine Waters. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But and she's not the only one. There was a whole Nancy Pelosi, and these are people who have constantly told people to do these things, and then they hide behind. They just hide in the corner, say it didn't really happen when their words come to fruition. I will say.
And so that's where I think the lady that, the disturbed individual that did this was propagandized, was a victim of being led into, like, if we want to look at her as a victim, then she was also a victim, a lot of propaganda and a lot of conditioning toward a hate crime, toward Christians, towards straight people, toward that church, Christian schools, toward children. And now you're hearing a lot of hate crime talk around children, and even Jane Fonda making horrific comments and these after effect comments. It's showing you where the community and society can be bent to and toward with enough propaganda, and what's justifiable hate crime and what's not a justifiable hate crime. It's just insanity. And it wasn't the guns, it was a disturbed individual. I don't care about their sexual spectrum or where they're at.
Nobody does.
She who wanted to be a he was disturbed and had problems, and it's just too bad that people died, and it's too bad that they were led into hate. And it's too bad that they were told that they aren't acceptable the way that they were, and felt that they needed to change, and had all the support to do that, and all the support to hate on Christians, and all the support to turn it toward that, and all that angst was turned in that area. So I find it interesting that Vanderbilt University is also in Nashville, who make a lot of money off the gender reassignment surgeries, by the way.
Big business. Huge
good
business.
point.
So to that point, real quick, part of this is apparently she says her family didn't accept her. I'm sorry if that's true, I feel terrible for her, but that does not give her the right to pick up a weapon and go kill innocent people to make a point.
Children and 3 children.
And I think everybody on this team knows me well enough to know when I say I don't care who you sleep with, I don't care who you sleep with. I really don't. You shouldn't be doing it with children. That's clearly out of bounds. But if you want to, if you believe in gerbils, if you love gerbils, and if you know what I mean by loving gerbils, go knock yourself out. Gerbil power.
We're
know,
not
if you
going to
wanna
go
have a
there.
little flag with
Anyway.
gerbils, go
Yeah.
knock yourself out. But
No.
it's not something that we should be allowing people to be victimized by because, oh my gosh, you don't agree with my point of view. I'm going to punish you. I'm going to actually take out my vengeance on others. That's not acceptable. But the left allows that. The political left allows for these groups that they believe are victims to be allowed to do whatever they want relating to violating the rights of others. And that's not
You're right.
Here's a quick Tony's take. We have a few minutes left. Quote of the week on, I believe it was Fox News. Senator John Kennedy said, either Mayorkas believes in open borders or he's not qualified to manage a Chuck E. Cheese. What's your take on that?
I think he could be one of the Amatron, the robots. He could be like the guy strumming in the background on Chuck E. Cheese.
I wouldn't want him making
he's
my
got
pizza.
the bald head. He could No, look, I listened to some of that testimony from Senator Kennedy, and literally there were 810 deaths at the border this past year in 2022 of migrants coming up. That's literally an order of magnitude more than under Trump. Literally, the number of encounters is through the roof, and the fact is that Mayorkas is purposely trying to open the border, keep it open, because the Democrats have decided that they believe that illegal immigrants are going to be a permanent underclass that serves to reelect them indefinitely. That's why they're trying to spread these groups all around the nation. And the presumption is if we can change the demographics, it's also called replacement theory, which is like, I don't necessarily like that term, but it's what they're doing. They're trying to get people into all these red districts and undermine the culture. That's what's going on. That's why they're so committed to this. 5 million have come in. 5 million people have come in since Biden's been president. And I don't know how that's acceptable.
Well, they're trying to get them to vote. The other thing they're trying to do, and I'll make this really quick, is bring in people in the urban areas, the blue areas, where they can actually gain more population to gain more representation in the House. Right. That's another thing.
So to that point, we have allowed a permanent underclass to establish itself. Mayorkas was actually confronted by Ted Cruz during the same hearing, where Ted Cruz pulled out little armbands. For those watching, you can see what I'm doing. You have these things, but for those listening to us, Ted Cruz had pulled out color-coded bands, little plastic bands, which go on the arms of illegal immigrants that are color-coded to the amount of money they owe the coyotes for coming across. And Mayorkas was asked about that, and he didn't know what they were. Now, I think he knew what they were, but he lied.
Of course he did.
Literally, they've allowed the industrialization of illegal activities on the border. You have cartels now making headway, bringing human trafficking across, sending little girls and boys into sex trafficking, and then obviously the drugs and fentanyl is all coming across. So this is not being done by accident. It's being done by purpose. And God bless Kennedy and Cruz for calling it out. So I think that's it, right? We're out of time again. Wow.
It's that time. It goes so fast.
Where does the time go? I mean, it's been a quick show as always. So we thank our audience. We thank you all for being here and supporting us. We always look forward to your feedback, comments, and other observations. So we're always open to that. We appreciate you all being here. And of course, a big shout out to my friend Cherie Curry, who's still on tour in Europe. Thank her for allowing us to use Rock and Roll Oblivion. So hopefully we're leaving the oblivion and doing better things with our lives now. And again, I've been joined by our great crew of Elizabeth Breckenkamp, Whisker Danny, and Tanya Miller. We'll see you all again real soon on The Hard Truth, powered by Sig Sauer. Never settle.
I woke up in a derelict delirium to a stranger's kiss and a broken opinion.